Hi, we just connected a minute ago though, so maybe some others are having problems.
I have to push this mute button.
Have you heard from
Can
the
you guys
voice?
hear me?
They can hear you.
Okay.
I just
We should have another kid coming too, but
Neither of them said anything.
so you text them and they haven't responded.
Yeah.
That was not anybody telling us what's wrong.
So they can like just save one screen.
Yeah. Until you share your presentation.
So is it recording or should
I don't-
go ahead?
No, I found the list. There's like 5 or 6 schools. This is just the extension center in winter, so the schools must be having a problem.
Does it tell you who's supposed to be on for schools?
Yeah, they sent me an email about it.
Hello? Yep, we managed, we're connected. I think the schools are having trouble connecting now, but the regional center did. Mm-hmm. Oh. Okay. Well, I will let them know that then.
She said just to go
When-
ahead and.
Okay.
Okay, let me tell. I'm just going to pass that on quick. 1 second, you can hang on. Kim, can you hear me? Kim?
I don't think
Kim's
she's
not
here.
here.
Yep. Oh, sorry. Well, I just heard that. I guess it sounds like all the schools except Chester are connected.
Oh, okay.
The DDN place
Thank you.
just called me back.
Okay.
Okay, so Chester.
We'll just go ahead soon.
Okay.
Yeah, just.
Sounds
Okay.
good. I'll text that teacher and tell him that. Okay. Thanks, bye.
Okay,
We're
so,
on the other one, right there.
okay,
Except PC.
PC.
Shows it over there, so they should see that.
Okay, you can get rid of that, and I don't have to call or anything, or do
No.
push begin. That'll start
Actually, just
recording.
close that one. No, they got the recording going.
Okay, oops. All right.
And they can
Guess
hear
we'll
you.
just keep going. Hi. My name's Anine Ross. I'm from DENR, and I'm going to talk about aquatic ecology today. So, winter, I guess if there's something you want to hear about in particular, you can go ahead and make a request. I'll probably skip around because I think this only goes till 5. And there's 60 slides in the presentation, so it can be more of a study guide. And I'll just try and cover concepts today. So if you want to go back, I know Kim will put it up on the website and it'll be available to you. I'm going to throw a lot at you. Don't be too concerned if you've never heard of river continuum concept, or just as an example, like the name of the theory isn't important. It's just some of the concepts. It can be described by this theory. So we're going to cover water chemistry for sure, some of the biological zones in lakes, rivers, and wetlands, and we'll just see what we have time for today. So go ahead. I also have an expectation, a list of aquatic ecology expectations. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. I have a really quiet voice, so. I have a list of aquatic ecology expectations because I know the schools from last year, we wanted to give you guys some better guidelines. So I found them online. They're from 2015 and it's a different area, but I think that'll help you if you go through them and at least know all the concepts that they're addressing. Then it should give you a better idea of what you still need to know to study. Some of the keys that are going to be on the test, like there's no way around it. You have to study fish and learn about South Dakota fish and just be able to identify them. Oh, there's other screens now. And the aquatic invertebrates, you will have a key, but you should be familiar with some of the major groups of invertebrates. I'm going to go through a few things on water chemistry. Unhealthy or healthy watersheds is a pretty important concept. What is found in each of them? What are characteristics of each of the types of watersheds? And I would say also you really need to know just the common species, threatened and endangered species, and important invasive species. And those are just, you have to learn them and identify them. Sources of pollution and prevention, that's a good thing to think critically about and have a couple ideas. I'll get into that a little bit. And our current issue this year is the agricultural soil and water conservation stewardship. So knowing how that relates to aquatic ecology, there will probably be some questions related specifically to the current topic. I won't spend too much time on these textbook definitions of watershed, but you just want to remember that includes all the land and water features, and it's defined by the outlet. So a watershed is as big or small as upstream of the outlet as you make it. So you could say here in Pierre, we're in, I think they call it like the Snake Butte watershed. It's pretty small. Or you could just take Capitol Creek as an example. Or you could blow it up to the whole Missouri River. Those would both be watersheds. And so it's spatially dependent. So how you define it depends on what the outlet is and like how big of a scale you're looking at. And throughout the presentation, I bolded terms. So if I skip over them, the bolded terms are ones you probably need to be pretty familiar with. So tributary, riparian zone will come up a bunch, so I'll just define it now as the areas bordering rivers and other bodies of surface water. So they would include the floodplain and the riparian buffers adjacent to the floodplain. And then because our current topic is agricultural soil and water conservation stewardship, how riparian buffers are really important BMP for healthy watersheds. So how does that work with agricultural stewardship? Also in the riparian zone, groundwater is found at the shallower depths, so that makes more water available to the plants and vegetation in the riparian zone, so you often see a different vegetation type that can help define it. You can see a sort of a green belt with a characteristic suite of plants that are adapted to that shallow water table. And then watershed boundaries, or the watershed divide, just in case it comes up, it's defined by the topographic features. So the highest elevation is, like the line of highest elevation is going to define your watershed boundaries. And here's an example of what I mean by a large watershed area. This is showing U.S. water resource regions. These are HUC2s, so hydrologic unit code. This is the biggest scale you can go up. So at the biggest scale, most of South Dakota drains into the Missouri River. There is a small portion that drains into the Red River, and a small portion that drains the Minnesota, which goes to the Mississippi River. So that would be a very large scale watershed. What I mean by HUC, those are defined watersheds at different spatial scales. So these watershed boundaries is showing North Dakota and South Dakota. These would be 8-digit HUCs. So you can see those green areas each have 8 digits. So the smaller you get, actually the bigger the number becomes. It's not too important, but it's just a way of organizing what spatial scale we're looking at. So this would be an 8-digit HUC. And then these are not defined exclusively by the HUCs that I just talked about, but these are our river basin. This is a map of our river basins. So a question might come up as to, know the major rivers. There's not too many of them. The dams and the reservoirs on the Missouri, probably be good to know. Okay. How watersheds work, defined by the outlet and the topography, and this shows the watershed divide, and just a different representation of the headwaters, tributaries, and riparian wetlands in there. Okay, here's a very blurry watershed cross-section with more terms to know. I threw in water table in there, which we didn't, for the teams that were on last year, we didn't talk too much about groundwater, but that could come up, so it's probably another area to study. So we define water table as the upper zone of saturation. We didn't really talk about stream orders before either. So we number streams. Orders kind of, it tells you how much water is in them. Like the tributary, the headwater streams they start with ones. When 2 ones come together, that's called a confluence, when you have 2 similar size stream orders coming together. So 2 ones coming together forms a second order stream. 2 second orders coming together forms a third order stream. 2 third order streams forms a fourth order. And a lot of times you'd have a first order coming into a third order. That doesn't change the order of the third order. It's just a first order coming into a third order. But it helps describe where you are in the watershed. So if you know we're talking about first order streams, you're up in the headwaters. And fourth order is pretty much like a main stem river, like the James or the Big Sioux would be a fourth order stream. Okay. Here's a little bit more about groundwater. So there's some terms for you. Aquatic ecology is just covers so much, and we're kind of getting into geology a little bit. But as a review, if you haven't had this before in like earth sciences, the unconfined aquifer, that is not covered by an impermeable layer of rock. So an impermeable does not let water through. Permeable lets water through. Example of permeable materials are sand and gravel, something where water can easily travel. And impermeable layer that would form a confined aquifer would be shale or clay, something where the water is going to perch on top. It's not going to pass through that layer. So an unconfined aquifer has no impermeable layers on top. Like the water can move freely from the surface down through it. Then you have these confining beds, which might be that layer of rock that's impermeable. And then underneath that, if you have an aquifer between the confining beds, that's going to be a confined aquifer. And remember, groundwater is always moving through the aquifers. So we have recharge areas where water moves downward from the surface to groundwater to help replenish the groundwater that's been depleted. And then a discharge area, we have, if streams are flowing during the summer and there hasn't been any rain recently, that's called base flow. That's basically groundwater that is coming out and joining the stream and providing that water. So that would be discharge. That's water moving from groundwater to surface water. So you can have both happening. And confined aquifers, because water doesn't move as freely between them, that takes much longer for the water to travel through there versus a confined aquifer where it rains, the water soaks in, and eventually makes its way to the stream, and that can take years or days, depending on where it is. Here's a better diagram of what's going on. I guess it wouldn't hurt to know artesian wells are under pressure, and that's because you're between two confined layers, you're in that confined aquifer. So if you have an artesian well, the water's under pressure, it's going to come back up. Versus a water table well, that's just tapping down into your unconfined aquifer, so you need a pump or something to bring it up. And these links that I have on the page, they go into a lot more detail because I know I'm racing through these really fast, so check them out. Okay, probably not going to go into too much detail on delineating a watershed, but lots of teams missed the delineating the watershed question last year. It can be a little bit tricky. I just offer the suggestion first. Find where your outlet is and mark it on the map. It sounds really simple, but that just having it marked will let you know, will let you see visually, okay, these high points are going to drain to this outlet here. There might be high points further down in the watershed, but they might not drain to that outlet. So if we're going to do a lake delineation, we mark the outlet shown in blue on the map, and then we're going to look at our topographic map and mark all the high points. And if you haven't done a delineating the watershed before, it wouldn't hurt to grab a topo map and just familiarize yourself with it. And mark the high points in the watershed. So we know our outlet is here on Loop Lake. We marked all the high points, and then we're going to draw perpendicular lines from the outlet to these high points to know does that high point drain to this outlet or not, and if it's going to go over a hill or another high point in between, it's not going to drain to the outlet. So those two lower high points are marked in red, are not going to drain to our outlet here. So It's on the presentation. You can print it out and just practice it yourself, but just try and connect the high points that drain into the watershed of interest. And then when you mark the high points at kind of at the end of the watershed, then you're going to draw a line that follows the topographic lines, like the actual contours, perpendicularly down to the outlet point. So at right angles as much as possible. So that's why you make this turn here. So that'd be a good thing just to print out and try it yourself. Okay, moving on to biological zones in the lake. And unfortunately, there's just a lot of different terminology, and we don't know what the test terminology is going to use, or if you made it to the nationals, what they are going to call things. So I tried to put a couple different vocab words in that basically mean about the same thing. So we have our riparian zone again in the lake with the terrestrial plants. That's how you would tell the boundary between the riparian zone and the lake out in the water. And then your littoral zone is your beach zone, and that's going to extend out until you have plants growing in the water. So you have emergent plants growing out of the water, and then submerged plants that might grow under the water. But if that plant can be rooted into the sediment, it's still in the littoral zone. So the littoral zone and these open water zones might overlap. If you have a really shallow lake, the whole lake might be a littoral zone if there's plants growing from the bottom and able to photosynthesize there. And you move into the limnetic or the pelagic zone, and that's your open water zone. But if you're in a small lake, like that sort of might overlap. You could have limnetic zone, but the whole thing is also a littoral zone. So the boundary doesn't have to be as clear cut as this diagram puts it. But limnetic or pelagic zone is your open water zone. And then you can break, so you've broken your zones going out into the lake. Then from the top down, you would break it into the euphotic or photic zone. That's telling you photosynthesis occurs in that area. If you have a shallow lake, that might extend all the way to the bottom. And then aphotic or profundal zone is where photosynthesis does not occur. It's too dark, there's not enough light. So that's important to know if you're in a deeper lake, if there is that stratification there. And then the benthic zone is your sediment that underlies everything. So that extends from the edge of the lake down into the middle of the lake and up the other side. That's your benthic zone, the sediment where detritus, nutrients, sediment coming in is all stored. Okay. Then we'll talk briefly about river zones, and these aren't as clear cut in time and space because rivers are more changeable even than lakes are. But we're just looking kind of for different habitat types here when we're talking about river zones. So your major habitat types are runs, riffles, and pools. Pools, and if there's an easy way to categorize this, they might have different biology in them, different fish and macroinvertebrates, but pools are just deep, slow water. Riffles are shallow, fast water, and runs are deeper water that is fast, but there's not the turbulence you get with the riffles. And then to know that woody debris also makes a habitat type that can be important for fish and macroinvertebrates too. And then also kind of bringing in some of the geology stuff, we have erosional zones where you can guess erosion occurs. That's going to be on your cut banks, the sections of the river where active erosion is happening, and then your depositional zone where the water slows down enough for the for the river to drop its load of sediment. And those are going to be on point bars and just shallow sandy areas. And sort of related to that erosional depositional thing, you want to think of what's going on in the floodplain. And that's the zone that water extends during a flood. Like the river's going to come out of the channel where the water is right now into the floodplain. And the more a river meanders, the more energy is dissipated through the curves in the meanders. And it's good to have point bars and cut banks and meanders in your river. Otherwise, you get channelization where the river becomes a straight line and it becomes very fast. It destroys a lot of habitat for fish and macroinvertebrates, and it can be harmful once there is a flood because there's not that energy that's dissipating with all the meanders. And so I put in some meander scars. It's pretty amazing how much the river moves, and you can still see them from space. So I guess I'd think about how the shape of the river, how much meander or how channelized it is. What does that mean for flood control and agriculture and development in that floodplain? Okay, here's some pictures of South Dakota floods. And then geomorphology is just a fancier way of saying the shape due to the geology. Again, it's just showing that rivers have different types. Like you can categorize what the channel looks like as it moves downstream. If you have a very steep slope, it's actually going to have a pretty straight channel. If you think about a mountain stream and it's coming down a hill, and there aren't going to be a lot of meanders back and forth. And as the slope changes, the natural shape of the river changes too. So that's kind of just a caveat in there. It's not quite as simple as just wanting lots of meanders in your river. The slope and geology plays an important role. And then on the right-hand side of the screen are some erosional processes. And don't get caught up. You don't have to know what the stages all mean and when it's aggregating and degrading, but just know that as if there's active down cutting, like the bed of the river is being cut away, that is causing more erosion, that is contributing to the bed load of sediment. Or it could be from the banks, when the river is widening. If it's not in a state of equilibrium and it keeps widening, it's drawing more and more erosion from the banks. So you want to have a river where there's not active erosion happening in either direction. You want it in equilibrium. If there's downcutting or widening going on, the river channel is unstable and there will be more erosion. Okay. And then I should have put the reservoirs with the lakes, but all the processes that happen to lakes happen even faster in a reservoir. The way reservoirs age and fill up with sediment, because they're basically damming a river, and the things are just speeded up in a reservoir. It will fill up with sediment. It will undergo eutrophication faster. And here in South Dakota, we have a lot of reservoirs, so that's a special concern to us. If the reservoir can be flushed out by periodic flood events, that helps kind of reset the reservoir, but if it just gets a trickle at a time, it just fills up very slowly with sediment. And this is showing one of our big sediment problems at Lewis and Clark Lake in Springfield, South Dakota. And we also want to know about drought and aquatic ecology. Here's some questions for you just to think about. How does drought affect water quality and quantity? And we have drought a lot in South Dakota too, and what are the implications of that? Okay, And we'll get into water chemistry. Here's a list of parameters that we measure very often. So most of the time we go out. pH is very important to measure. Should understand the alkalinity to acidity scale and be able to do a pH test and understand the results. In South Dakota, we usually say 5 to 9 is safe. Too high of a pH is a problem in our state, and that occurs when there's an algae bloom occurring at that time and eutrophication going on. The pH can get too high to be safe for some types of fish. We measure sediment a lot. We have a lot of sedimentation problems, and we want to extend the life of lakes and reservoirs, so that's something we measure. E. coli, it's very important to people being able to use and recreate in the water. That's the most common bacteria we measure for. I put down fish flesh mercury. It's not something that's measured a lot, but Game Fish and Parks measures fish flesh to know. So you can look up and see if your local water body has a mercury problem, because that is a human health concern. And dissolved oxygen is very important too. And with the dissolved oxygen, you would also want to take conductivity and temperature measurements, because that will help you interpret your dissolved oxygen data. And then there are other chemicals we test for, but unless there's a mining problem, we wouldn't routinely measure for arsenic and cadmium. Okay, this is some of the theory going into dissolved oxygen and eutrophication. I'll just define eutrophication first as the excessive richness of nutrients in a lake or water body, frequently due to runoff from the land, which can cause dense plant life and the death of animal life from the lack of oxygen. So to know you have a eutrophication problem, you're going to see that first in the dissolved oxygen becoming lower afterward. And that doesn't really occur until the algae has started dying off. So there's a little bit of a time gap between them happening, but low dissolved oxygen will tell you that you had a eutrophication problem. Lakes do naturally progress towards more production, so there's always sediment and everything off the land coming into the lake all the time, so it's naturally going to become more productive. And reservoirs, again, they fill with sediment and age more quickly than lakes, and are susceptible to eutrophication problems. When you have the increase of nutrients, and we look at nitrogen and phosphorus as our main nutrients that cause problems, they can accelerate algae growth and then increase the eutrophication. In the overly productive lakes that contain algae, the algae grow, bloom, and die, and after they die off, that causes the crash in dissolved oxygen that impacts the fish. Also, once there's a layer of oxygen-poor water on the bottom of the lake, that causes this phenomenon we call internal loading, where even more phosphorus that was bound in the sediment becomes available, it's kind of just a vicious cycle where there's more nutrients available. And in addition to looking at dissolved oxygen just as a snapshot in time when there could be a problem, we also want to look at biological health of the fish and macroinvertebrate communities to see if they can survive in these conditions, if there is possibly a eutrophication problem or not. Okay. This graph you don't have to worry exactly about what it's doing, but it's just showing dissolved oxygen and temperature and how much they fluctuate day to day and over the year. So in general, when water temperature is high, there's less oxygen in the water, and that's just that's a property of water. It holds less oxygen when the temperature is high, and when temperature is low, that can hold more water in it. But then you also see the cycles of vegetation dying off or photosynthesizing during the day, producing more oxygen during the day. But then during the night, there's respiration going on, so that oxygen is used up. And when the algae finally have a massive die-off, then you would see a major drop in dissolved oxygen. It's kind of a complicated but really interesting phenomenon, so I just spend a little time and see if you understand this. And if there's anything you want to email me or want further clarification on, I'll try and provide it. Not all of our lakes mix. When you learn about lakes in school, you might learn about how lakes can stratify. That's just, there's different layers of different temperature water, and that happens more in deeper lakes. The surface will heat up during the summer, and then the cooler water stays underneath, and there's not mixing going on until you have the turnover in the fall. So when you have stratified layers by temperature, it's also showing, well, those waters also aren't mixing their oxygen. So you can have stratified by oxygen too. And don't worry about the terms epilimnion, metalimnion, and hypolimnion. There's just a small diagram showing you that the temperature decreases as you go down in the lake, and it can stratify. So this will be a stratified lake in that diagram. If it was a mixed lake, then it'd be a straight line all the way down. The lake would be the same temperature. So when you have two major sections of temperature in that lake, then that's letting you know that that lake is stratified. Here's just a simple diagram of the lake fertilization process, which I probably should have put earlier. So you have fertilizers that flow into the lake that lead to excessive weed or algae problems. And then they grow, and then they die. And that active decomposition and the respiration that goes on, that's what causes the dissolved oxygen to plummet, which can kill the fish. So it doesn't have to be an oxygen of 0, but pretty close to it. So we use the terms anoxia, which means no oxygen, or hypoxia, which means little oxygen. And then, unfortunately, once you have that lower layer of low oxygen water, that can cause more phosphorus to be released from the sediments, accelerating the cycle, continuing. And then that's just oxygen and fertilization going on, but you've also got carbon cycles and nitrogen cycles in lakes too. Another side effect of eutrophication, it can be when you have a harmful algal bloom, and that's when your algae is a cyanobacteria species. So there's green algae, and there's cyanobacteria. There's also red algae and diatoms. They all can be grouped under algae. But there's a special kind of algae that are cyanobacteria that can produce cyanotoxins. So you can't tell a regular algae bloom from a harmful algal bloom, other than if you take a sample and look at the cells under a microscope. But someone in our department took these pictures of a boat passing through an algae bloom, and then when they were on the lake later, the same location, they took another picture, and you can really see how green that water is. Another effect of nutrients is way downstream in the Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone that forms every year, and that's due to nutrients being washed in from upstream the Mississippi River. Here's a little graphic on how it works if you're interested. And then there's this river continuum concept, and that just considers the river over its whole length and how the slope changes from the headwaters, where you'd expect higher slopes, and shifting the energy and nutrients downstream. Species change as you move downstream too. This idea of the river continuum is just considering the river stream as a whole, from the headwaters down into the lower order streams. And there is a neat graphic about how the macroinvertebrates and fish can change, and you can find a little more information on that if you're interested. Watershed health is really important. A healthy watershed just has the structure and function to support healthy habitats and environment, aquatic environments. And EPA lists a couple things that would be included in a healthy watershed. Not saying all of these are going to be present, probably because no watershed would be considered healthy. But you want intact headwaters, functioning floodplains where the channel is not just channelized, it has room to meander, good healthy riparian corridors, especially if there's some shading going on to protect the fish life and provide energy through leaf and litter. Refuges, biotic refugia, I think that just means large woody debris and ample habitat for all the macroinvertebrate and other creatures that live in there. You'd want to have natural vegetation if possible on the landscape, or at least vegetation that isn't cornfield to the edge of the stream. You want to have a functioning hydrology. A lot of our streams are intermittent. That means they don't flow all year round, but that's their natural state. That's okay. But if it's supposed to be a stream and too much of the water has been diverted and it doesn't have the same hydrology that would be an unhealthy stream. You'd want to be able to move sediment in a healthy way where there's point bars and there's meanders going on and you're depositing sediment throughout, not just so when a flood comes in it totally scours the whole stream. And then Minnesota DNR had a good definition for watershed health, where you compare the current condition with an estimate of how a natural condition would be for that stream, to know if it's unhealthy or not. And here's a nice little graphic of healthy and unhealthy streams and what you'd find in each of them. Go through that. I'll touch really briefly on wetlands. They have enormous value for plant and wildlife life, and store carbon, nutrients, and sediment, things that are going to wash into the stream. The wetlands act as a big sponge and a trap, soaking up pollution and nutrients that would otherwise wash downstream. They improve water filtration. They filter the water that moves through them. And then they collect water, like this picture of the prairie potholes show, and allow that water to sit on the landscape so it's not just running off into the river. It's sitting there, maybe even recharging some of the groundwater. And anything that's going to slow down runoff going into the stream is going to be a good thing. And wetlands provide that service very well. The Army Corps of Engineers regulates the fill of wetlands, but then most of the wetland delineations are done by an agency in USDA and RCS. And they are identified by these three components: hydric soils, wetland plants, and then periodic flooding, periodic to permanent flooding. And then our prairie potholes are very important for breeding migrating waterfowl too. Here's food webs in a pond. I'm just gonna skip through these, but this graphic is showing a food web. It's got salt marsh plants in there, so it's I guess it's more of a marine food web than a freshwater one, but you could have plants on the bottom, or you could have algae on the bottom as your producers, and that might determine like what your lake looks like. If you have a lot of plants growing in it, macrophytes we call them, like the large plants that you can see and get stuck in your boat propellers, that is going to keep the water pretty clear, versus a lake that's entirely dominated by algae. It's just going to get green during the summer. And I might not make it through all these aquatic animals, but again, just know the major groups, be able to identify using a key, and then the fish, I think you just have to pick up a copy of the common fishes, which I put on the website, or look through the South Dakota, the fishing report. They have a section at the back with all the common fish in it. So there's some, I'm going to talk about macroinvertebrates first, probably because you guys are less familiar with them. And so we have the functional roles that the macroinvertebrates can play. These are based on their mouth parts and how they feed. So it's just another way to categorize them, but you can look through that. Pollution tolerance, I will cover that because we did have a pretty big question that people got a little confused about on pollution tolerance last year. So here's a hypothetical data sheet. What you're doing with a pollution tolerance index is you're identifying your set of invertebrates. So last year we had a test and there was maybe 7 different kinds of macroinvertebrates. You're supposed to be looking at your pollution tolerant index as figuring out the pollution tolerance for each of those species and then adding them up as the index instructs you to. So go back and look at this sheet. I think this actually lists 4 groups. I think our sheet that we've used before only uses 3 groups of macroinvertebrates, but you're going to go through and identify them, assign a number value to the sensitive, the insensitive, and the not sensitive to pollution species, and then tally them up. Okay, and I put together some information on the macroinvertebrates. The highlighted terms, those are kind of like a general grouping. So I'd be familiar with the highlighted terms, and then I color-coded the pollution tolerance for each of them. Not that you have to memorize them, but it might be good to know, hey, a gill snail, that's a pollution intolerant snail. Most snails and most of the other invertebrates on this list shown here are pollution tolerant. And to have at least a couple good examples of invertebrates that are very pollution tolerant and those that are not. Okay, so I think I've only got 3 minutes or so. You can look through and learn about flatworms, annelids, and mollusks. And then I broke the other group of invertebrates into the arthropods. Here's the arachnids, the crustaceans, and the insects. And then the insects have a couple examples of each of the orders of insects. I put in quotes our sensitive EPT taxa. That stands for the order Plecoptera, Ephemerata, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. Those are your pollution sensitive taxa. So if you could remember those examples, you'll be doing well. And I put a little information together on each of them. And you will probably have to identify some given a key, but knowing what some of the vocab words pertain to beforehand might help. So I put a list together here. Knowing where the gills are in a macroinvertebrate can be really helpful if you know what to look for. Because they can have gills in really crazy places. Some of them have abdominal gills. think it's the mayflies that have the gills. Let me just check that, make sure it's right. Yeah, it's, sorry, the damselflies that have the 3 gills on the end of the abdomen.